My older sister made my life an absolute nightmare, while my parents shielded her from every consequence. I was kicked out of my own home at 18 with nothing but a single duffel bag and a fabricated criminal record hanging over my head. 12 years of complete silence passed. Then my mother called me frantically crying that my sister needed my help to avoid losing everything. When I heard exactly why they were begging for my money, I could not stop myself from laughing out loud. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to build your own empire after your family tried to completely destroy your future. I am Kendra, 30 years old, and I am the founder and CEO of a highly successful private equity firm based in Chicago. I built my life brick by brick, far away from the toxic performative world of the Atlanta black elite that my parents worshipped. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was sitting at the head of a massive mahogany boardroom table on the 45th floor of my downtown Chicago office building. The panoramic windows behind me offered a sweeping view of the city skyline, a constant reminder of how far I had climbed. We were in the final hour of negotiating a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate acquisition. The room was filled with high-powered attorneys, financial analysts, and executives who hung onto my every word. The atmosphere was incredibly tense, the kind of high-stakes environment where I thrived. Right in the middle of reviewing the final contract clauses, my executive assistant walked into the room. She knew better than to interrupt a closing, but her face was completely pale. She walked quickly to my chair and slid a cheap prepaid burner phone across the polished wood table. It was the absolute last resort emergency number I kept active solely for situations of life or death, a number only one person from my past possessed. I excused myself from the table, stepping into my private glass-walled office and closed the door. When I answered the call, I did not even get the chance to say hello. "Kendra, you need to get on a plane to Atlanta right now." The voice on the other end hit me like a physical blow. It was Vivian, my mother. I had not heard that voice in 12 long years. There was no warmth, no hesitation, no questioning how her daughter was doing after more than a decade of complete estrangement. Instead, her tone was frantic, demanding, and laced with that familiar, arrogant entitlement she always used to control our household. "Monique is about to lose everything." Vivian continued, her breath hitching in a performative panic. "You need to wire $250,000 to her legal team by Friday or Preston is going to be indicted." I stood frozen by the window looking out over the Chicago River. For a moment, the sheer audacity of her demand robbed me of my speech. I was processing the reality that my mother had broken a 12-year silence, not to apologize, not to check if I was even alive, but to demand $250,000 to save the sister who had happily watched my life burn to the ground. Preston, Monique's white husband, was a smooth-talking tech entrepreneur who heavily relied on my father's mega-church connections to fund his endless stream of failing startup companies. I had kept tabs on them from a distance over the years, watching their house of cards grow taller and more unstable. "What kind of trouble is Preston in?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously calm and completely devoid of emotion. "It is just a minor business misunderstanding," Vivian insisted, quickly trying to downplay the severity, just like she always did when it came to Monique's mistakes. "Some investors are getting overly aggressive about their returns, and they are threatening to go to the federal authorities. Preston just needs the retainer fee for a top defense attorney to make this whole misunderstanding go away quietly before Sunday service." "You have that kind of money now, Kendra. People talk. We know you are doing well up there. You need to come home and fix this." I pulled the phone away from my ear for a second, genuinely amazed by the delusion. And then I laughed. It was not a chuckle or a polite scoff. It was a deep, resonant laugh that echoed off the glass walls of my office. All the fear, all the residual childhood trauma, all the conditioning that told me I had to obey this woman simply vanished in that single moment of pure amusement. "You find this funny?" Vivian shrieked, her panic instantly morphing into toxic rage. "Your sister's husband is facing federal prison, and you are laughing." "I find it hilarious, Vivian," I replied, dropping the title of mother entirely. "I find it absolutely hilarious that you spent 12 years pretending I do not exist only to call me and demand $250,000 to save a white tech bro who clearly stole money from your congregation." Vivian gasped, reverting immediately to the old toxic playbook she had used to control me as a teenager. You owe us, Kendra. You owe this family after the absolute disgrace you caused us when you were 18. You dragged our name through the mud and we still let you walk away. The least you can do is help your sister when she is in desperate need. The blood in my veins turned to ice. She had just crossed the one line I had sworn never to let anyone cross again. The bustling boardroom outside my glass walls faded into the background. I was no longer just the CEO closing a deal. I was the 18-year-old girl standing on the curb with a single bag watching her family turn their backs on her. I do not owe you a damn thing, I said, my voice dropping an octave sharp and lethal. And let us get one thing perfectly clear right now. I did not cause a disgrace. I was the scapegoat for your golden child. How dare you, Vivian sputtered, trying to maintain her righteous indignation. No, how dare you? I cut her off, refusing to let her control the narrative. Do you really want to talk about what happened 12 years ago? Because I remember it perfectly. I remember coming home from my high school graduation to find Pastor Thomas screaming about $15,000 missing from the megachurch building fund. I remember Monique standing in the kitchen, crying fake tears while hiding the receipts for the designer bags and luxury vacations she had secretly bought to keep up with her rich sorority sisters. You were a troubled child, Vivian tried to interject, her voice wavering. I was a straight-A student, heading to college on a full academic scholarship. I fired back relentlessly. Monique was the one failing out of her pre-law program. Monique was the one who stole the church funds to pay off her massive credit card debt. And when the church board started asking questions, you and Pastor Thomas decided it would look much better if the rebellious younger daughter took the fall, instead of the perfect older sister, who was supposed to be the pride of the community. You are rewriting history because you are bitter, Vivian said, but she sounded breathless, cornered by the truth she had buried for over a decade. I am stating the facts. I continued, my voice echoing with years of suppressed righteous anger. You and Pastor Thomas framed me. You told the church elders I stole the money. You packed one single duffel bag of my clothes, threw it onto the driveway, and kicked me out onto the streets of Atlanta. You threatened to have me arrested if I ever tried to tell the truth. You sacrificed your own flesh and blood to protect Monique's pristine image and her precious law school scholarship. We did what we had to do to protect the family ministry. Vivian finally cracked her voice, dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper. The church would not have survived the scandal of the pastor's eldest daughter stealing from the offering plate. You were tough, Kendra. We knew you would survive out there. I gripped the edge of my desk, my knuckles turning white. The casual admission of their cruelty, the absolute lack of remorse, even after 12 years, solidified everything I needed to know. They did not view me as a daughter. They viewed me as collateral damage. I did survive, I said smoothly, reclaiming my power. I moved to Chicago. I put myself through finance school, working night shifts. I built a private equity firm from the ground up. I am worth more now than your entire congregation combined. And you think you can call me, insult me, and demand my money to save the sister who happily watched you throw me to the wolves? Kendra, please. Vivian's tone suddenly shifted, realizing her threats were completely ineffective against the woman I had become. She resorted to begging. Preston got involved with some bad private lenders. If he goes down, Monique goes down with him. They will take her house. They will take everything. You are the only one who has the liquidity to make this stop. We are family. We share genetics, Vivian. That is not the same thing as being family, I replied coldly. I am begging you, Kendra. Just send the money. I will never ask you for anything ever again. Just pay the retainer. I let the silence hang on the line for a long, agonizing moment. I looked out at the Chicago skyline, the empire I had built with my own blood, sweat, and tears. I thought about the terrified 18-year-old girl who slept on park benches because her parents cared more about a church's reputation than her safety. I am not giving you a single dime, I stated clearly and definitively. Vivian let out a sharp cry of frustration. You are really going to let your sister be destroyed out of petty vindictiveness? You are a monster. I am a businesswoman, I corrected her. And while I am not sending you a wire transfer, you should know that I am flying down to Atlanta tonight. Vivian paused, confusion evident in her voice. You are coming here? Why? If you are not going to help us, why are you coming? Because my firm just finalized a rather large acquisition this morning. I explained, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. You see, Preston's bad private lenders were actually a subsidiary of a much larger commercial debt portfolio covering the entire Buckhead district. My firm just purchased that entire portfolio at a premium. What are you saying? Vivian asked, her voice trembling with a new profound terror. I am saying I am not flying down to be your savior, Vivian. I am flying down because I now own the debt on Preston's failing tech startup. And while I was at it, I went ahead and bought the outstanding commercial loans attached to Pastor Thomas's megachurch. I do not just hold Preston's fate in my hands anymore. I own the ground you walk on. Have the guest room ready. I will see you tomorrow. I ended the call and dropped the burner phone into the trash can beside my desk. I took a deep breath, smoothing the lapels of my custom suit. The scared little girl from Atlanta was dead. The CEO had just entered the chat and I was going to dismantle their entire facade piece by piece. I turned around, opened my office door, and walked back into the boardroom to finish my meeting, ready to prepare for a homecoming, 12 years in the making. The tires of my chauffeured Escalade crunched over the pristine white gravel of my parents' circular driveway. The drive from the airport had been a masterclass in emotional compartmentalization. Atlanta had changed over the last 12 years, growing taller and wider, but the oppressive heavy heat remained exactly the same. I sat in the plush leather back seat, adjusting the cuffs of my bespoke charcoal wool suit. I had chosen this exact outfit for a very specific reason. It did not scream for attention. It was tailored sharp and cut with the kind of quiet, lethal precision that only real, unrestricted money could buy. It was the absolute opposite of the loud, label heavy aesthetic my family always used to project their fragile status to the congregation. My driver shifted the massive vehicle into park and rushed around to open my door. The humid Georgia air hit my face instantly, a sharp contrast to the crisp autumn breeze I had left behind in Chicago just hours earlier. I stepped out onto the driveway and looked up at the sprawling brick estate. Buckhead had not changed much. It still smelled of old money, blooming magnolias, and desperate pretension. This house was a monument to Pastor Thomas and Vivian. It was a physical manifestation of their obsession with maintaining their image among the local black elite. 6 massive white columns held up a portico that looked like it belonged on a courthouse rather than a residential home. The double mahogany front doors were flanked by oversized ornate urns. To any of their devoted church members driving by, the estate looked like a fortress of divine blessing and untouchable wealth. It was designed to make you feel small before you even reached the front step. But my eyes were no longer those of a scared 18-year-old girl begging for shelter. My eyes belonged to a woman who dismantled failing corporations for a living. I saw the subtle cracks the congregation never would. I noticed the cascading stone fountain in the center of the driveway was bone dry. The copper piping at the base had oxidized to a dull green, meaning the water pump had been broken for months, and they simply could not afford the contractor to fix it. I looked at the surrounding landscaping. The Bermuda grass was cut short in the front, but the azalea bushes near the side wrought iron gates were severely overgrown, tangled with creeping weeds. The expensive landscaping service had clearly been scaled back or canceled entirely. Then my gaze shifted to Preston and his prized silver Porsche, parked near the 3-car garage. I walked casually past the vehicle, my heels clicking sharply against the pavement. A quick glance at the license plate revealed expired registration tags. A man facing a federal indictment for a massive financial scam usually stops paying the state vehicle department first. The entire estate was bleeding money, bleeding status, and bleeding reality. They were drowning. Yet they had the sheer nerve to summon me here and demand I throw them a lifeline. I grabbed my sleek leather briefcase from the back seat, thanking my driver and instructing him to keep the engine running. I did not plan on staying for dinner. Walking up the wide brick steps to the front entrance, I realized I did not feel a single ounce of anxiety. 12 years ago, I had stumbled down these exact same steps, sobbing uncontrollably, clutching a cheap canvas duffel bag. I had begged my father to listen to me. I had screamed that I did not steal the church funds, that Monique was lying to cover her tracks, that she had bought those designer bags with his congregation offering money. I remembered the heavy thud of these exact mahogany doors slamming in my face, sealing my fate and leaving me homeless. Now I stood on their welcome mat as the woman holding the deed to their ruin. I reached out and grasped the heavy brass knocker, letting it fall against the wood with a loud, echoing crack. I did not have to wait long. The door swung open almost immediately, revealing Vivian. My mother had barely aged. Though her face looked tight, pulled taut by stress and cosmetic procedures she could likely no longer afford. She was wearing a silk blouse and pearls, completely dressed up for a simple Tuesday afternoon at home, always performing for an invisible audience, always on stage. Her eyes darted over my tailored suit, pausing briefly on the subtle flash of the six-figure luxury watch on my wrist. I saw the calculation happening in her head in real time. She had clearly expected the broken, rebellious teenager she had thrown away. She expected someone she could easily intimidate and control. She was entirely unprepared for the cold, polished executive standing on her porch. "You took your time getting here," Vivian snapped, stepping aside and crossing her arms defensively. "We expected you on the morning flight. Preston has lawyers breathing down his neck, and you are treating this family crisis like a vacation." I stepped over the threshold, letting the heavy door click shut behind me. The grand foyer was exactly as I remembered it, dominated by a massive crystal chandelier and a sweeping double staircase. But the air inside felt stale, thick with unsaid panic and desperation. I glanced at the wall lining the staircase. It was covered in framed family portraits. Pastor Thomas preaching at the pulpit, Vivian smiling at a charity gala, Monique in her graduation gown, Preston and Monique on their wedding day. There was not a single picture of me. They had completely erased my existence from their history to preserve their perfect lie. "My time is incredibly expensive, Vivian," I said smoothly, not bothering to offer a hug or even a polite smile. "And my flights are booked on my own schedule on my own private jet. Now where is the sister I am supposedly here to save?" Before Vivian could formulate a response to my unapologetic tone, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the formal living room down the hall. I turned to see Monique and Preston rounding the corner, moving with an aggressive, entitled energy that completely ignored the reality of their collapsing world. They were not walking toward a savior. They were walking toward a bank, fully expecting me to just hand over the combination. They had absolutely no idea that I was already planning to lock them inside the vault. Monique walked into the grand foyer with the exact same arrogant strut she had perfected in high school. She was 33 years old now, but she still carried herself like the untouchable princess of the youth choir. She wore a pristine white designer wrap dress and a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the light of the chandelier above us. Her hair was styled in flawless cascading waves without a single strand out of place. To anyone else, she looked like the epitome of buckhead elegance and grace. To me, she looked like a woman fiercely denying the reality that her entire life was currently actively burning to the ground. Walking right behind her was Preston. My white brother-in-law was 36, but he dressed like a college sophomore who had just watched a documentary about Silicon Valley billionaires. He wore a quarter-zip cashmere sweater pushed up at the sleeves, dark designer denim, and pristine white sneakers. He had the kind of unearned, easy confidence that only comes from a lifetime of never facing a single consequence. He walked with a casual swagger, completely unbothered by the fact that federal authorities were currently dissecting his bank accounts. "Well, look who decided to grace us with her presence," Monique said, stopping a few feet away from me. She crossed her arms, her eyes sweeping over me with undisguised disdain. "You could not have taken an earlier flight. We have been waiting all morning." There was no greeting. There was no thank you for dropping everything to fly across the country. There was not even a basic acknowledgement of the 12 years of absolute silence between us. She spoke to me exactly the way she always had, as if I were a nuisance she was forced to tolerate. Preston stepped around his wife, flashing a bright, highly practiced smile that did not reach his cold eyes. He extended a hand toward me, but when I simply stared at it, he dropped it and shoved it into his pocket with a soft scoff. "Kendra Preston," said his voice dripping with condescension. "It has been a long time. I see you are still trying a little too hard to fit into the corporate world. You can relax the stiff suit around us. We are family. There is no need to play dress up here." I did not break eye contact with him. I let the silence stretch for a long, uncomfortable moment while his smirk slowly began to falter. I am not playing anything, Preston. I replied, my voice smooth and dangerously level. This is custom-tailored charcoal wool. It commands rooms that you do not even have the security clearance to enter, and I assure you the last thing I feel around you is relaxed. Vivian let out a sharp gasp behind me, clearly horrified that I was not instantly bowing to her son-in-law. Do not speak to Preston that way in this house. He is going through an incredibly stressful ordeal, and you will show him respect. An ordeal he created, I fired back without looking at her. Let us take this into the kitchen, Vivian hissed, glancing nervously toward the front windows, as if the neighbors could hear us through the reinforced glass. We need to discuss the financial arrangements immediately. Monique turned on her heel and marched toward the back of the estate. Preston followed, shaking his head and muttering something under his breath about my attitude. I walked behind them, taking in the details of the sprawling kitchen. The massive double marble islands were covered in scattered legal folders, printed emails, and half-empty coffee cups. It was the visual aftermath of a severe panic attack. Preston leaned casually against the edge of the marble island, crossing his ankles. He picked up a pen and twirled it in his fingers, attempting to look completely in control of the disaster laid out before him. Look, Kendra, Preston began adopting the patronizing tone of a professor explaining a simple concept to a slow student. The situation has been blown wildly out of proportion. My newest tech venture, Synergy Cloud Solutions, simply encountered a minor cash flow bottleneck. That is entirely normal in the high-growth startup sector. You would not understand the nuances of venture capital pacing, but it happens every day. I crossed my arms, staring at the sheer audacity radiating from him. You are facing an indictment for wire fraud and embezzlement, Preston. That is not a cash flow bottleneck. That is a federal crime. Monique slammed her hand flat against the marble countertop. Do not use those words in this house. Preston is a visionary. The problem is that my father brought in a bunch of old traditional deacons from the church to act as angel investors. Those old men do not understand how technology scaling works. They panicked because a few deadlines were pushed back, and now they are threatening to go to the authorities just because their quarterly dividends were delayed. The irony was so thick it practically choked the air in the room. 12 years ago, Monique had stolen $15,000 from the church building fund to finance her luxury lifestyle, and my parents had framed me to protect her. Now she was married to a man who had actively leveraged my father's pulpit and the trust of his black congregation to steal what was likely millions of dollars from those exact same people. And once again, my parents were shielding the golden child, entirely willing to sacrifice anything to preserve the illusion of their flawless family. They are not threatening to go to the authorities because they do not understand technology, Monique, I said calmly. They are going to the authorities because your husband took their retirement savings and seed money and clearly spent it on something else. Preston scoffed loudly, tossing the pen onto the counter. You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. The funds were reallocated to cover operational deficits. It is a standard pivot. The issue is that we need liquidity right now to satisfy the most aggressive investors and pay the legal retainer for my defense team to shut down this ridiculous inquiry before it goes public. And that is where I come in, I stated, confirming the trap they were trying to set. Monique lifted her chin, looking down her nose at me with a profound sense of entitlement. Yes, we need $250,000 wired to Preston's attorney by Friday morning. And since the banks are currently being uncooperative due to the pending inquiry, Preston needs to secure a short-term bridge loan to cover the investor payouts. Preston picked up a thick stack of stapled papers from the island and slid them across the smooth marble surface until they stopped right in front of me. He flashed that arrogant, empty smile again. We are going to allow you to co-sign the bridge loan, Kendra, Preston said, speaking as if he were granting me a highly exclusive privilege. It is a win for everyone. You get to finally contribute something meaningful to this family after your past behavior, and having your name attached to my ventures will actually give your personal credit profile a nice boost once my company goes public. I looked down at the predatory loan agreement sitting on the counter. The interest rate was astronomical, The terms were absolute financial suicide. They were not asking for a favor. They were demanding that I legally chain myself to a sinking ship, offering up my pristine financial standing to be destroyed by his criminal incompetence. You should be expressing gratitude, Monique added, her voice sharp and commanding. We are giving you a chance to make amends. Mom and Dad have suffered for years because of the embarrassment you caused them when you were a teenager. You owe this family everything you have. Signing that document is the absolute least you can do to prove you are not the exact same selfish, destructive failure we kicked out 12 years ago. I stared at the two of them. They stood shoulder to shoulder, united in their absolute delusion. They truly believed that I was still the broken, desperate girl who craved their validation. They believed they could snap their fingers and I would eagerly hand over my wealth and my future just to earn a seat at their toxic table. They had not learned a single lesson in over a decade, and they had no idea that their arrogance was about to cost them everything they held dear. Monique walked into the grand foyer with the exact same arrogant strut she had perfected in high school. She was 33 years old now, but she still carried herself like the untouchable princess of the youth choir. She wore a pristine white designer wrap dress and a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the light of the chandelier above us. Her hair was styled in flawless, cascading waves without a single strand out of place. To anyone else, she looked like the epitome of buckhead elegance and grace. To me, she looked like a woman fiercely denying the reality that her entire life was currently actively burning to the ground. Walking right behind her was Preston. My white brother-in-law was 36, but he dressed like a college sophomore who had just watched a documentary about Silicon Valley billionaires. He wore a quarter-zip cashmere sweater pushed up at the sleeves, dark designer denim, and pristine white sneakers. He had the kind of unearned, easy confidence that only comes from a lifetime of never facing a single consequence. He walked with a casual swagger, completely unbothered by the fact that federal authorities were currently dissecting his bank accounts. Well, look who decided to grace us with her presence, Monique said, stopping a few feet away from me. She crossed her arms, her eyes sweeping over me with undisguised disdain. You could not have taken an earlier flight. We have been waiting all morning. There was no greeting. There was no thank you for dropping everything to fly across the country. There was not even a basic acknowledgement of the 12 years of absolute silence between us. She spoke to me exactly the way she always had, as if I were a nuisance she was forced to tolerate. Preston stepped around his wife, flashing a bright, highly practiced smile that did not reach his cold eyes. He extended a hand toward me, but when I simply stared at it, he dropped it and shoved it into his pocket with a soft scoff. Kendra, Preston said, his voice dripping with condescension. It has been a long time. I see you are still trying a little too hard to fit into the corporate world. You can relax the stiff suit around us. We are family. There is no need to play dress-up here. I did not break eye contact with him. I let the silence stretch for a long, uncomfortable moment while his smirk slowly began to falter. I am not playing anything, Preston. I replied, my voice smooth and dangerously level. This is custom-tailored charcoal wool. It commands rooms that you do not even have the security clearance to enter. And I assure you the last thing I feel around you is relaxed. Vivian let out a sharp gasp behind me, clearly horrified that I was not instantly bowing to her son-in-law. Do not speak to Preston that way in this house. He is going through an incredibly stressful ordeal, and you will show him respect. An ordeal he created, I fired back without looking at her. Let us take this into the kitchen, Vivian hissed, glancing nervously toward the front windows, as if the neighbors could hear us through the reinforced glass. We need to discuss the financial arrangements immediately. Monique turned on her heel and marched toward the back of the estate. Preston followed, shaking his head and muttering something under his breath about my attitude. I walked behind them, taking in the details of the sprawling kitchen. The massive double marble islands were covered in scattered legal folders, printed emails, and half-empty coffee cups. It was the visual aftermath of a severe panic attack. Preston leaned casually against the edge of the marble island, crossing his ankles. He picked up a pen and twirled it in his fingers, attempting to look completely in control of the disaster laid out before him. Look, Kendra. Preston began adopting the patronizing tone of a professor, explaining a simple concept to a slow student. The situation has been blown wildly out of proportion. My newest tech venture, Synergy Cloud Solutions, simply encountered a minor cash flow bottleneck. That is entirely normal in the high-growth startup sector. You would not understand the nuances of venture capital pacing, but it happens every day. I crossed my arms, staring at the sheer audacity radiating from him. You are facing an indictment for wire fraud and embezzlement, Preston. That is not a cash flow bottleneck. That is a federal crime. Monique slammed her hand flat against the marble countertop. Do not use those words in this house. Preston is a visionary. The problem is that my father brought in a bunch of old traditional deacons from the church to act as angel investors. Those old men do not understand how technology scaling works. They panicked because a few deadlines were pushed back, and now they are threatening to go to the authorities just because their quarterly dividends were delayed. The irony was so thick it practically choked the air in the room. 12 years ago, Monique had stolen $15,000 from the church building fund to finance her luxury lifestyle, and my parents had framed me to protect her. Now she was married to a man who had actively leveraged my father's pulpit and the trust of his black congregation to steal what was likely millions of dollars from those exact same people. And once again, my parents were shielding the golden child, entirely willing to sacrifice anything to preserve the illusion of their flawless family. They are not threatening to go to the authorities because they do not understand technology, Monique, I said calmly. They are going to the authorities because your husband took their retirement savings and seed money and clearly spent it on something else. Preston scoffed loudly, tossing the pen onto the counter. You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. The funds were reallocated to cover operational deficits. It is a standard pivot. The issue is that we need liquidity right now to satisfy the most aggressive investors and pay the legal retainer for my defense team to shut down this ridiculous inquiry before it goes public. And that is where I come in, I stated, confirming the trap they were trying to set. Monique lifted her chin, looking down her nose at me with a profound sense of entitlement. Yes, we need $250,000 wired to Preston's attorney by Friday morning. And since the banks are currently being uncooperative due to the pending inquiry, Preston needs to secure a short-term bridge loan to cover the investor payouts. Preston picked up a thick stack of stapled papers from the island and slid them across the smooth marble surface until they stopped right in front of me. He flashed that arrogant, empty smile again. We are going to allow you to co-sign the bridge loan, Kendra, Preston said, speaking as if he were granting me a highly exclusive privilege. It is a win for everyone. You get to finally contribute something meaningful to this family after your past behavior, and having your name attached to my ventures will actually give your personal credit profile a nice boost once my company goes public. I looked down at the predatory loan agreement sitting on the counter. The interest rate was astronomical. The terms were absolute financial suicide. They were not asking for a favor. They were demanding that I legally chain myself to a sinking ship, offering up my pristine financial standing to be destroyed by his criminal incompetence. Preston tapped a manicured fingernail against the thick stack of papers. We already filled in your information, Monique said breezily. Preston has a notary friend on standby. You just need to sign at the bottom of page 7 and initial the exhibits. Once the wire transfer clears tomorrow morning, the church board will calm down and we can put this entire ugly business behind us. I stared at the paperwork, marveling at the sheer, unadulterated delusion it took to hand this to a private equity chief executive. You want me to personally guarantee a $500,000 loan at 22% interest for a company currently under investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission. I said, my voice dangerously soft. You want me to attach my name, my credit, and my corporate reputation to a man who took venture capital from elderly church deacons and spent it on absolute garbage. Preston slammed his hand flat against the marble. It is not an investigation. It is a standard compliance audit. You are blowing this completely out of proportion because you want to play the victim again. We are offering you a way back into the fold, Kendra. A way to finally earn your place at this table. Vivian stepped forward, her voice trembling with manufactured maternal disappointment. Why do you always have to make things so difficult? Your sister is offering you an olive branch. We are willing to forget the shame you brought on us 12 years ago. We are willing to welcome you back into the congregation. All you have to do is sign the paper and do your part for the family." Before I could tear into Vivian's twisted definition of a family, a deep booming voice echoed from the hallway leading to the formal dining room. "The prodigal daughter returns, but she brings her pride instead of her repentance." Pastor Thomas stepped into the kitchen. My father had aged, but he still carried the heavy, imposing presence of a man who commanded thousands of people every Sunday morning. He wore a custom-tailored suit, his posture rigid and commanding. He walked toward the kitchen island with the slow, deliberate pace of a judge preparing to deliver a sentence. This was the exact same posture, the exact same tone he had used 12 years ago when he stood in the church lobby and told the deacons that I was a troubled thief who had broken my family's heart. I did not shrink back. I did not lower my eyes. I stood up straighter, squaring my shoulders to meet his gaze. "I do not have anything to repent for, Thomas," I replied, refusing to use the title of father. "But looking at this fraudulent contract, it seems your son-in-law has quite a few sins to answer for." My father stopped at the end of the marble island. He placed his large hands on the counter, leaning forward to loom over me. It was a classic intimidation tactic. He was used to women shrinking in his presence. He was used to unquestioned obedience. "You will watch your tone in my house," he thundered, letting his famous pulpit voice fill the massive kitchen. "You will not disrespect the man who provides for your sister." Preston is a pillar of our church community. He is doing the Lord's work by bringing modern innovation to our congregation. You have been gone a long time, Kendra. You have lost your way in that secular city up north. You forgot what it means to honor your family. I let out a short, sharp laugh. Honor. You want to talk about honor? You threw your 18-year-old daughter out onto the street with nothing but a duffel bag to cover up Monique's credit card theft. You lied to your entire congregation to protect your golden child. There is absolutely no honor in this house. There is only a cheap coat of paint over a rotting foundation. Monique gasped, dramatically clutching Preston's arm. "Dad, are you going to let her speak to us like this? After everything we do for this family?" Pastor Thomas raised a hand, silencing Monique without looking at her. His eyes remained locked on mine, burning with a toxic, controlling fury. He thought I was still that terrified teenager who needed his validation to survive. "I am giving you one final chance, Kendra," my father said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "You will pick up a pen. You will sign that guarantee. You will wire the funds by tomorrow morning to clear Preston's name. If you do this, you may stay for dinner. We will pray over you, and we will forgive your past transgressions. And if I do not?" I challenged, tilting my head slightly. "Then you are dead to this family," he declared, striking the marble with his fist. "You will be dead to this church. You will be dead to the entire Buckhead community. I will make sure every pastor, every business owner, and every socialite in Atlanta knows that you turned your back on your own flesh and blood in their hour of need. You will have no home here. You will have no name here. You will leave this house right now, and you will never, ever return." The kitchen fell dead silent. Vivian looked smug. Monique wore a triumphant smirk. Preston crossed his arms, looking down his nose at me. They all genuinely believed that the threat of exile would break me. They believed that losing my place in their superficial status-obsessed world was the ultimate punishment. They had no idea that I had already built a fortress they could not touch. I looked at the four of them, studying the arrogant certainty on their faces. Then I unclasped the brass lock of my leather briefcase. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, capped red marker. I removed the cap with a slow, deliberate click. I placed the tip of the red marker at the top right corner of Preston's ridiculous loan agreement. Without breaking eye contact with my father, I drew a massive, jagged red line completely across the page, tearing slightly through the expensive paper. Monique shrieked, jumping back as if I had just set the document on fire. "What are you doing? Are you insane?" Preston lunged forward. "You stupid, arrogant little girl," he started to yell, reaching for the ruined contract. But I was faster. I reached into my briefcase a second time and pulled out a crisp, heavy stock manila folder. I slammed it down directly on top of the ruined loan agreement. The loud smack echoed off the high ceilings of the kitchen, instantly silencing Preston's outburst. I slid the folder smoothly across the marble until it hit Preston's chest. He looked down at it, his face suddenly draining of color. Printed perfectly centered on the top document was the logo of my private equity firm. Just below it in bold, unmistakable letters were the words, "Notice of default and intent to foreclose." "What is this?" Pastor Thomas demanded, his booming voice faltering for the very first time. "That is a reality check," I said, my voice ringing out with absolute authority. Preston did not just owe money to random private lenders. He borrowed against his tech company, he leveraged the church's commercial accounts, and he put up the deeds to his investment properties as collateral. When he defaulted 3 months ago, those lenders bundled his toxic debt and sold it off to stop their bleeding. My firm bought that entire portfolio yesterday morning. I stepped closer to the island, leaning in, so I was eye to eye with my father. The balance of power in the room shattered into a million pieces. "You cannot make me dead to you, Pastor," I whispered, every word sharp and lethal as a razor blade. "I already buried the version of me that cared about your approval 12 years ago. But I can make you homeless by Monday. I own Preston's company. I own the commercial loans on your beloved megachurch. And if I do not see a complete surrender of your assets by the end of the business day tomorrow, I will legally strip every single thing you value, right down to the studs." The silence that followed my ultimatum was absolute. For exactly 10 seconds, the only sound in the massive kitchen was the low hum of the custom refrigerator. I watched their eyes dart from the foreclosure notice bearing my company logo to my face and back again. They were searching for a crack in my composure, for any sign that this was an elaborate bluff. Preston was the first to break the silence. He let out a loud, exaggerated bark of laughter that echoed off the marble countertops. He picked up the notice, holding it delicately by the corner, as if it were a dirty napkin, and tossed it back onto the island. "You actually had me going for a second there, Kendra," Preston said, running a hand through his hair and flashing a condescending smile. "I will admit it is a cute stunt. You printed out some intimidating legal jargon on some expensive cardstock to scare us. But you and I both know you do not have the kind of capital required to buy out a commercial debt portfolio of that magnitude. You are running a boutique firm in Chicago. You are not BlackRock." I stood my ground, my hands resting lightly on my leather briefcase. "I do not need to be BlackRock to recognize a sinking ship," I replied smoothly. "And I certainly do not need to forge documents when your actual signature is right there on the default notices." Preston shook his head, his smirk widening as he leaned his weight against the counter. He was retreating into his privilege, wrapping himself in the delusion that he was the smartest person in the room, simply because he had always been treated like he was. "Listen to me very carefully," Preston continued, adopting a patronizing tone that made my blood boil. "Even if your little shell company managed to scoop up some bundled junk debt, you have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with. I have the best corporate defense attorneys in Atlanta on retainer, men who play golf with judges and senators. If you try to enforce this piece of paper, my legal team will tie your firm up in litigation for the next 20 years. We will drain your resources in discovery alone. You will be bankrupt before you ever see the inside of a courtroom. You do not have a legal team on retainer anymore, Preston," I stated calmly. "You burned through your legal fund 3 weeks ago trying to settle quietly with the initial investors you defrauded. I know this because my firm acquired those settlement agreements during the debt transfer. Your lawyers dropped you yesterday when your final check bounced. That is exactly why you need my $250,000 by Friday." A muscle in Preston's jaw twitched. The smirk completely vanished from his face. For a fraction of a second, the terrified fraudster beneath the confident tech executive peeked through. But before he could formulate a lie to cover his tracks, Monique lunged forward. She slammed her hand down on the foreclosure notice. "You are a sick, twisted liar," Monique screamed, her flawless composure finally shattering into pieces. "You did not buy anything. You came here to torment us because you are completely obsessed with my life. You have always been obsessed with me." I looked at my older sister, truly marveling at her capacity for self-deception. "Obsessed with you," I repeated, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. "Yes," Monique yelled, her chest heaving as she pointed a manicured finger at my face. "You have been jealous of me since we were teenagers. You are jealous that I stayed in Atlanta and maintained our family status. You are jealous that I married a brilliant, successful white man while you are sitting up in Chicago all by yourself, playing pretend executive. You could not stand the fact that I got the perfect wedding, the perfect house, and the perfect life while you got kicked out. So you fabricated this entire ridiculous story to try and tear me down. Vivian immediately moved to stand beside her golden child, wrapping a protective arm around Monique's shoulders. My mother glared at me with a look of profound disgust, slipping effortlessly into the gaslighting tactics she had used to control my reality since childhood. Your sister is right, Vivian said, her voice dripping with fake maternal pity. You really need psychiatric help, Kendra. I thought moving away might heal whatever darkness was inside you, but clearly you have only gotten worse. Coming into my home waving fake legal documents and threatening your own family out of pure spite. It is tragic. You have become a bitter, lonely woman who cannot stand to see her sister happy. I looked at Vivian, feeling a familiar twinge of the old pain, but I quickly crushed it. There was no mother in front of me, only a warden desperately trying to keep the walls of her prison intact. If my documents are fake, I countered, my tone completely unbothered. Then why did you call me crying this morning? If Preston is so brilliant and successful, why are you begging a bitter, lonely woman for $250,000? We were trying to be generous by including you. Vivian lied, without missing a beat, her eyes darting nervously toward Pastor Thomas. We thought giving you the opportunity to help your family would be a path to redemption for you. We wanted to give you a chance to clear your conscience after what you did to this church 12 years ago. But clearly you are beyond saving. Pastor Thomas took a heavy step forward, placing himself between me and the rest of his family. He puffed out his chest, using his physical size to try and intimidate me, just like he did when I was a teenager. But I was no longer a frightened child looking up at him. I was a grown woman looking him dead in the eye. You will not bring this demonic energy into my house. Pastor Thomas boomed, his voice vibrating with absolute authority. You do not own the house of the Lord. The church belongs to the congregation and to God. No secular bank, and certainly no disrespectful wayward daughter, can ever take the sanctuary from me. I built that ministry with my bare hands. You built it with your hands, I corrected him. But you leveraged it with your greed. You co-signed Preston's commercial loans, using the church deed as collateral. You risked the sanctuary to fund his fake companies because you wanted the social prestige of having a wealthy tech executive in the family. You gambled the house of the Lord Pastor, and the house lost. That is a lie! Pastor Thomas roared, his face turning an alarming shade of red. My signature on those documents was a mere formality for a temporary bridge loan. The church board approved a short-term encumbrance based on guaranteed returns. The returns were a fantasy, and you know it. I fired back, stepping even closer so there was no mistaking the absolute certainty in my voice. The loan defaulted. The grace period expired last month. The debt was sold. I own it, and I am calling the note due. They stared at me, trapped in a paralyzing cycle of denial. They could not accept the reality of the situation because accepting it meant acknowledging that the daughter they had discarded was now the architect of their destruction. It meant admitting that their entire existence was a carefully constructed fraud. We are not giving you a single asset, Preston sneered, regaining a sliver of his false bravado. You can take your fake foreclosure notice and march right out that front door. I am calling my financial backers in the morning. We will secure the capital, pay off whatever minor debt actually exists, and then I am going to make it my personal mission to ruin your reputation in the financial sector. I will make sure you never close another deal in Chicago again. You can try, I said, reaching down to close the brass clasp of my briefcase. The sharp click echoed loudly in the tense kitchen. But you should probably check your email first. I sent official copies of the default notices to all of your current investors about an hour before I arrived. They already know the money is gone. Preston lunged for his phone sitting on the marble counter, his hands visibly shaking as he unlocked the screen. He scrolled frantically, his eyes widening in pure terror as he read the incoming messages. Monique grabbed his arm. Preston, what is it? What did she do? He did not answer her. He just stared at the screen, the reality of his impending ruin finally breaking through his arrogant delusion. I turned toward the hallway, adjusting my suit jacket. Since you have declined my offer to surrender your assets quietly, I will let the legal process run its course, I announced over my shoulder. Enjoy your evening in this house while you still have the keys. I will see you all in court. I did not wait for their response. I walked down the long hallway toward the grand foyer, my heels clicking a steady, victorious rhythm against the hardwood floor. But I knew this was not the end. People like my parents and my sister did not surrender quietly. They fought dirty. And as I reached for the heavy mahogany front door, I knew exactly what their next desperate move would be. I walked out of those heavy mahogany doors and instructed my driver to take me straight back to my luxury suite at the St. Regis. I slept perfectly that night, completely unbothered by the frantic voicemails piling up on my phone. I knew my family did not possess the emotional maturity to accept defeat gracefully. They operated on pride and delusion, which meant they were bound to retaliate. Sure enough, less than 24 hours after I had handed them their own financial ruin, my phone buzzed with an elaborate digital invitation forwarded by Vivian. It was billed as an exclusive impromptu welcome home gala for their beloved daughter. The location was their Buckhead estate. The time was that very evening. I stared at the screen and let out a soft, knowing laugh. I knew exactly what they were doing. They still believed my foreclosure documents were an elaborate bluff. In their minds, no child of Pastor Thomas could ever truly possess the power to destroy him. They assumed I was just a bitter woman trying to scare them. More importantly, they were setting a trap. They knew they could not bully me in private anymore, so they decided to use the one weapon that had always kept me and everyone else in our community in line: public pressure. They were going to pack their home with the wealthiest, most influential members of their congregation and corner me. They thought if they put me on the spot in front of the local politicians, the elite church deacons, and the socialites they so desperately wanted to impress, I would be forced to play the role of the dutiful, wealthy daughter. They intended to publicly announce my financial support for Preston, trapping me into writing that $250,000 check, just to avoid humiliating the family in front of Atlanta high society. It was a brilliantly toxic strategy, one that might have worked on the terrified teenager they threw onto the street 12 years ago. But it was completely useless against the woman I had become. I called my executive assistant in Chicago and told her to cancel my flight home. I was staying for dinner. I arrived at the estate just as the sun dipped below the tree line. The dry fountain and overgrown azaleas from yesterday were now hidden in the shadows, masked by expensive ambient landscape lighting and a small army of hired valet drivers. I stepped out of my car wearing a floor-length emerald green silk gown that draped flawlessly over my silhouette. I wore no flashy jewelry, only the quiet confidence of a woman who held the deed to the building we were all standing in. The moment I walked through the double doors, the suffocating atmosphere of performative wealth hit me. The grand foyer and formal living rooms were packed with about 30 guests. Waitstaff in crisp white uniforms circulated with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. A string quartet played softly in the corner. It was a masterclass in deception. Every person in this room was dressed to the nines, completely unaware that the very floorboards beneath their designer shoes were essentially owned by my private equity firm. Vivian spotted me immediately. She abandoned a conversation with a local city councilwoman and marched toward me. Her face stretched into a wide, terrifyingly fake smile. Before I could even say a word, she grabbed my upper arm, her manicured acrylic nails digging painfully into my skin through the silk of my dress. "You are going to smile, you are going to mingle, and you are going to play along," Vivian hissed through her perfectly white teeth, her voice low enough that no one else could hear. "Your father is taking a massive risk by bringing you into this room. You are going to fix the mess you made yesterday. When the time comes, you will stand by Preston and you will nod. Do not embarrass us." I gently but firmly pried her fingers off my arm, brushing the fabric of my dress, as if she had left a stain. "I am only here for the food, Vivian," I replied, my voice smooth and loud enough for a passing waiter to catch, and perhaps to enjoy the show. I walked past her, gliding into the crowded living room. Monique was holding court near the fireplace, playing the perfect supportive wife. She wore a stunning crimson cocktail dress, laughing loudly at a joke made by one of the senior church board members. Standing right beside her was Preston. He looked remarkably composed for a man facing federal wire fraud charges. He held a crystal tumbler of scotch, charming a group of older black gentlemen with his practiced, easygoing demeanor. I was leveraging his proximity to my father, using his status as the pastor's son-in-law, to extract trust from people who had spent their entire lives building their wealth. I grabbed a glass of sparkling water from a tray and began to circulate. It did not take long for the true nature of the evening to reveal itself. I was approached by Deacon Sterling, an older, distinguished man who had been one of my father's closest confidants since I was a child. He owned a highly successful chain of car dealerships across Georgia and was known as one of the most generous donors to the megachurch. "Kendra, look at you." Deacon Sterling beamed, pulling me into a warm fatherly hug. "Your parents have been talking about you all evening. We are so incredibly proud of the woman you have become. Building your own finance firm up in Chicago. It is a true blessing." "Thank you, Deacon Sterling," I said politely. "I am surprised my parents speak of me at all." He chuckled, waving a hand dismissively. "You know how your father is. He keeps his pride close to the chest, but he could not stop bragging today. He told us all about how you are stepping in as the lead investor for Preston's new cloud computing venture." I froze but kept my expression entirely pleasant. "Is that what he told you?" "Oh, yes," Deacon Sterling continued, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "And between you and me, we are all breathing a massive sigh of relief. Several of us on the Deacon board invested heavily in Preston's company. Your father assured us it was a guaranteed return, a way to build generational wealth for our families. But there have been some concerning delays with the payouts lately. Preston explained it was just a technical bottleneck with the offshore developers. Knowing that a financial expert like you has audited the company and is injecting fresh capital to take it to the next level makes us all sleep much better at night." The sheer gravity of their manipulations suddenly locked into place. This was not just a trap to force me to pay Preston's legal fees. This was a desperate cover-up. Pastor Thomas and Preston had used the church congregation as a piggy bank. They had convinced these hard-working, trusting deacons to pour their retirement funds into Preston's phantom tech company. When the money inevitably disappeared, the deacons started asking questions. To stave off a mutiny, my father had lied. He had used my name, my reputation, and my firm, without my knowledge, promising these men that his estranged wealthy daughter was swooping in to save the day and guarantee their returns. If I walked away tonight, or if I caused a scene, I would not just be embarrassing my parents. My father had set it up so that I would look like the villain who pulled out of a deal and destroyed the retirement savings of the entire church board. It was a sickening, brilliantly evil maneuver. "I am so glad my father shared his perspective," I told Deacon Sterling, my voice steady while my mind raced. "It is going to be a very memorable evening." I excused myself and walked toward the grand dining room. I needed to act fast. I pulled out my phone and quickly texted my lead financial analyst in Chicago. I demanded the exact unredacted offshore routing numbers and bank statements we had uncovered in Preston's debt portfolio the day before. I needed the hard, undeniable proof of where every single dollar of the deacon's money had actually gone. Before my assistant could reply, I felt a sharp tap on my shoulder. I turned to find Monique glaring at me. The fake smile she had been wearing for the guests was entirely gone, replaced by a look of pure, venomous desperation. "You are going to sit at the head table next to Preston," Monique ordered, her voice trembling slightly. "Dad is going to make the announcement right before dessert is served. He is going to talk about family unity and how you are backing the company. When he raises his glass, you are going to stand up, you are going to smile, and you are going to pledge your financial support in front of everyone. If you try to back out, these people will hate you forever. You will be the reason they lose their money." I looked at my older sister, feeling a profound sense of disgust. "You really thought you could trap me, Monique. You thought you could use the very community you stole from 12 years ago to force me to clean up your husband's crimes today. It is called leverage," Kendra, Monique sneered, stepping closer. "You might have some money now, but Dad has the power. He controls this room. He controls these people. You are going to write that check tonight, or you will never be able to show your face in the South again." My phone buzzed in my hand. I glanced down. The offshore bank statements had arrived in my inbox. The financial trail was devastatingly clear. Preston had not invested a single dime of the deacon's money into any tech venture. He had funneled it all into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands to cover his own personal gambling debts and to maintain his lavish lifestyle with my sister. I locked my phone and looked back up at Monique. A calm, chilling peace washed over me. I was no longer just defending myself. I was about to dismantle a criminal enterprise operating under the guise of holy righteousness. I cannot wait for dessert, I said softly. A loud clinking sound echoed from the dining room. Pastor Thomas was standing at the head of the massive candlelit banquet table, tapping a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The low murmur of the wealthy guests slowly faded as everyone turned their attention to the charismatic leader of their community. The trap was officially sprung, but they had no idea who was actually locked inside it with them. The loud clinking sound echoed from the dining room. Pastor Thomas was standing at the head of the massive candlelit banquet table, tapping a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The low murmur of the wealthy guests slowly faded as everyone turned their attention to the charismatic leader of their community. The trap was officially sprung, but they had no idea who was actually locked inside it with them. Friends, family, esteemed members of our congregation, my father began. His voice resonated through the grand dining room, rich and melodic, carrying the exact same cadence he used to command 10,000 people every Sunday morning. He smiled benevolently, looking around the table at the local politicians, the wealthy business owners, and the loyal church deacons who funded his lavish lifestyle. We have faced our share of trials this year. Pastor Thomas continued, placing a heavy, affectionate hand on Preston's shoulder. Preston has been working tirelessly on his visionary technology firm. As with any great endeavor that challenges the status quo, his company experienced some growing pains. Some of you sitting at this very table expressed concern about your investments. You worried that the vision was delayed, but I stand before you tonight to remind you that the Lord always provides a ram in the bush. A murmur of agreement rippled through the older church members. They were so accustomed to following his spiritual guidance that they were practically primed to accept whatever financial excuse he offered them. My father extended his other hand toward me, his face stretched into a portrait of absolute fabricated paternal pride. My daughter Kendra left us many years ago to find her way in the world. We prayed for her return every single day, and now she has come back to us. Kendra has spent the last 48 hours auditing Preston's brilliant venture. She was so moved by the potential of his cloud computing company that she has decided to pledge her personal savings to lead our next round of funding. Her generous investment will ensure that every single one of your initial contributions is secured and multiplied. Enthusiastic applause broke out across the dining room. Deacon Sterling cloudly, a look of profound relief washing over his tired face. Vivian beamed a fake teary-eyed smile, dabbing the corners of her eyes with a linen napkin. Monique glared at me from across the table, her eyes silently screaming a command for me to submit. Preston raised his glass of scotch toward me, looking unbearably smug. They all stared at me, fully expecting the sheer weight of social pressure to crush me into compliance. They thought I would rather sign away $250,000 than publicly humiliate my parents in front of Atlanta high society. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. The heavy silk of my emerald gown rustled in the quiet room. I picked up my champagne flute, picked up my own silver spoon, and tapped the crystal twice. The sharp ringing sound sliced through the remaining applause, bringing the room to a sudden expectant hush. "Thank you, Pastor," I said smoothly, my voice carrying the steady, lethal authority of a boardroom executive. "It is truly remarkable to be back in this house after 12 years of complete silence. But I'm afraid there has been a very significant misunderstanding tonight." I kept my posture perfectly straight, letting my gaze sweep across the faces of the wealthy investors before landing directly on my father. The benevolent smile on his face twitched. "I am not here to invest my savings into Synergy Cloud Solutions," I announced, ensuring my voice reached the furthest corners of the massive dining room. "In fact, I am not here to offer Preston a single dime." The smiles around the table instantly faltered. The collective relief evaporated, replaced by a tense, palpable confusion. Pastor Thomas gripped the edges of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning white. Kendra, my father, warned, a low, guttural threat masked by a strained teeth-baring smile. Do not let your nerves get the best of you in front of our esteemed guests. We discussed this family business privately. We absolutely did, I replied calmly. And I believe in total financial transparency, especially when it involves the retirement funds of the hardworking men sitting at this table. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my smartphone, unlocking the screen to access the unredacted documents my analyst had just sent me from Chicago. I placed the phone flat on the table, tapping the screen to keep it awake. Preston does not have a minor cash flow bottleneck, I stated clearly, turning my attention to the deacons. Preston is running a textbook Ponzi scheme. Gasps erupted from the guests. Chairs scraped against the hardwood floor as several people shifted uncomfortably. Preston shot up from his seat, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. She is lying, Preston shouted, pointing an accusing finger at me. Do not listen to her. She is a disgruntled, jealous sister-in-law who dropped out of college. She has absolutely no idea how corporate finance works. She is just trying to ruin this family because she is bitter. I run a private equity firm in Chicago that manages billions of dollars in commercial assets. I corrected him, elevating my voice just enough to shut down his frantic interruption. I know exactly how corporate finance works, Preston, which is why it took my analyst less than 20 minutes to trace where the congregation's money actually went. I picked up my phone and looked directly at the older man sitting to my right. Deacon Sterling, I said, my tone softening with genuine sympathy for the man who had been duped. Your initial investment of $300,000 did not go toward offshore software developers. It was wired directly to a private account in the Cayman Islands on August 12th. From there, $150,000 was used to cover Preston's mounting losses at a high-stakes sports betting syndicate in Las Vegas. Another $50,000 paid for the custom diamond tennis bracelet my sister is currently wearing on her left wrist. Monique gasped loudly and instinctively yanked her arm under the table, her face draining of all color as the guests turned to stare at her wrist. This is a complete fabrication, Vivian shrieked, abandoning her performative elegance entirely. She stood up, her chest heaving as she pointed a shaking finger at me. She hacked into our systems to frame my son-in-law. She is trying to destroy the ministry out of pure spite. I did not need to hack anything, Vivian, I fired back, meeting her furious gaze without a flinch. When my firm purchased the commercial debt portfolio for Buckhead yesterday morning, we acquired all of Preston's defaulted loan documents. He pledged his imaginary company assets as collateral. The financial forensics are completely irrefutable. There is no software. There is no cloud solution. There is only a black hole where your hard-earned money used to be. The dining room descended into absolute chaos. The polite, restrained atmosphere of the Buckhead elite shattered instantly. Deacon Sterling stood up, his chair falling backward and crashing onto the floor. He ignored my father entirely and marched straight toward Preston. You told me that money was securing infrastructure. Deacon Sterling roared, his voice shaking with rage. You looked me in the eye in the house of the Lord and told me my grandchildren's college funds were safe. Other board members followed suit, their voices rising in a cacophony of anger and betrayal as they demanded answers about their missing life savings. Preston backed away from the table, holding his hands up defensively. He looked to my father for protection, expecting the powerful pastor to silence the crowd. But Pastor Thomas was frozen in place. He was staring at the angry men approaching his son-in-law, realizing that the wealthy congregation that funded his lavish lifestyle was actively turning into a mob inside his own home. Preston, looking cornered and desperate, turned his vitriol back on me. You cannot prove any of this, he yelled over the shouting guests. Those bank statements are proprietary. You obtained them illegally. I will have you arrested for corporate espionage before you even make it to the airport. I smiled warmly at him, enjoying the sheer panic radiating from his entire body. I really think there is a misunderstanding about who holds the power here tonight, Preston, I said. I did not wait for him to respond. I simply reached back into my clutch and pulled out the second piece of evidence my team had sent over. It was not just proof of Preston's crimes. It was the undeniable proof that my parents had known about the fraud for months and had actively participated in covering it up to save their own social status. The trap they had set for me was entirely destroyed, and I was about to drop the final match on their burning empire. I unfolded the crisp sheets of paper I had just pulled from my clutch and laid them flat on the mahogany table right next to the offshore bank statements. The room was already buzzing with a dangerous low-frequency anger, but I knew what I was about to read would blow the roof completely off the estate. I looked directly at Deacon Sterling, whose face was currently a mask of pure betrayal, and then I shifted my gaze to my father. I raised my voice so it carried clearly over the rising commotion. "What I have here is a printed email chain dated 3 months ago," I announced. "The sender is Preston. The recipient is Pastor Thomas. The subject line reads Liquidity Crisis and Congregation Management." Pastor Thomas lunged forward, his heavy chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. "You will hand over those stolen documents right now," he roared, his pulpit voice cracking with raw panic. "You are violating the sanctity of this family." "The sanctity of this family died the day you traded your integrity for a country club membership," I fired back, holding the papers out of his reach. I looked back at the crowd of investors and began to read directly from the highlighted text. Preston writes, "Thomas, the offshore transfers are complete, but we are completely out of capital. If Sterling or the other board members ask to see the quarterly returns, we are finished. They will demand an audit." And Pastor Thomas, your esteemed spiritual leader, replies, "Hold them off. I will tell them the software development is in a quiet period. We will invite my estranged daughter down from Chicago. I will tell the board she is auditing the company to lead a massive Series A funding round. Her reputation will buy us enough time to secure a new loan." The grand dining room did not just descend into chaos. It erupted into absolute, unadulterated warfare. Deacon Sterling, a man who had served in the military before building the largest black-owned automotive empire in the state, slammed his fist onto the dining table with such force that the crystal champagne flutes shattered. The sharp sound of breaking glass was the starting gun. He grabbed Preston by the collar of his expensive quarter-zip cashmere sweater and yanked him forward, nearly pulling the tech executive over the centerpiece of white orchids. "You arrogant little thief!" Deacon Sterling bellowed, his face inches from Preston's terrified eyes. "You walked into our sanctuary, you ate at our tables, you preyed on our faith, and you stole the money I saved for my grandchildren. You think because you married the pastor's daughter you could come down here and run a con on us. You think we are stupid." Two other senior deacons men, who had previously smiled and clapped for Preston's fake visionary speeches, immediately flanked Deacon Sterling, cornering Preston against the bay windows. Preston threw his hands up in a defensive panic, stammering out pathetic excuses about market volatility and restructuring, but his smooth-talking Silicon Valley charm was completely useless now. The older men backed him into the glass, demanding their money, their voices overlapping in a barrage of furious threats. Across the table, Monique was unraveling in spectacular fashion. The pristine, elegant facade of the perfect buckhead socialite melted away, exposing the vicious, deeply insecure woman beneath. She ripped the diamond tennis bracelet off her wrist, the very bracelet bought with stolen retirement funds, and threw it onto the table as if it had suddenly caught fire. "You are a liar!" Monique shrieked at the top of her lungs, her perfectly styled waves whipping around her face as she pointed a manicured finger at me. "You fabricated those emails. You hacked his computer. You are doing this because you are sick in the head." I stood my ground, my posture relaxed, letting her entirely unhinged behavior speak for itself. "I am doing this because I refuse to be the collateral damage for your crimes again, Monique," I said calmly. 12 years ago you stole from this church and let me take the fall. I am just returning the favor." "You are a dropout!" Monique screamed, her voice cracking as tears of pure, desperate rage streamed down her face. "You have always been nothing but an ugly, bitter college dropout. You could not stand the fact that Mom and Dad loved me more. You could not stand the fact that I married a successful man and you are all alone. You built your little business, but you are still just the failure they kicked to the curb. Nobody in this room believes you over us. For us, we are this community. You are nobody." I looked at my older sister with a profound, icy pity. "I do not need anyone in this room to believe me, Monique. The federal authorities already have the routing numbers. Your husband is going to prison, and you are going to lose this house. No amount of screaming is going to change the math." Suddenly, a loud, dramatic gasp pierced the chaotic shouting. Vivian, realizing that her golden child was losing the screaming match, and that her husband's wealthy congregation was currently ready to tear her son-in-law apart, went for the only play she had left. The matriarch of the family clutched her chest, let out a theatrical, breathless cry, and collapsed onto the Persian rug. She hit the floor with an overly choreographed grace, ensuring her designer dress did not bunch up awkwardly. She lay there, one hand draped over her forehead, eyes fluttering closed as she began to hyperventilate. My wife, Pastor Thomas, yelled, seizing the opportunity to change the narrative. He rushed to Vivian's side, dropping to his knees. "Give her some space. The stress of these vicious lies has caused a medical emergency. Someone call an ambulance. Everyone needs to clear the room immediately." It was a classic desperate distraction tactic. In any other setting, the congregation would have rushed to the beloved First Lady's side, offering prayers and fetching glasses of water. But the spell had been broken. The deacons did not move toward Vivian. They did not bow their heads in prayer. They stood their ground, staring down at the woman on the floor with absolute, unrelenting disgust. "You can fake a heart attack all you want, Vivian Deacon," Sterling said, his voice dripping with venom. "It will not stop the police from auditing your bank accounts tomorrow morning." Vivian's eyes snapped open for a fraction of a second, shocked that her performance was not commanding the usual respect, before she quickly squeezed them shut again, committing to the bit. But the damage was already done. The absolute destruction of their reputation was complete. The wealthy politicians, the socialites, and the church elders began grabbing their coats and heading for the front door. They were pulling out their phones, frantically calling their own attorneys and accountants. The whispers of shock had turned into loud declarations of incoming lawsuits. Within 5 minutes, the grand dining room that was supposed to be the site of my public surrender had turned into a graveyard of my parents' social and financial standing. I watched the mass exodus with quiet satisfaction. I slowly packed my phone and my documents back into my leather briefcase, closing the brass clasp with a definitive click. The trap they had spent 24 hours building had successfully caught its prey, but it was not me. I had just dismantled their entire empire before the dessert was even served. The stampede toward the front door suddenly halted. Preston had pushed his way through the chaotic dining room and physically blocked the grand archway leading to the foyer. He raised both of his hands in a gesture of peaceful surrender, palms facing the furious church elders. The sheer audacity of the man was almost mesmerizing to witness. He had just been exposed for funneling millions of dollars into offshore gambling accounts, yet he instantly smoothed down the front of his cashmere sweater and adjusted his posture to project absolute authority. "Gentlemen, please," Preston said, his voice dropping into a calm, soothing register that was entirely unearned. "I need everyone to just take a deep breath. We are all intelligent, rational businessmen here. Let us not let a hysterical family dispute destroy a highly profitable partnership." I stood by my chair, watching him pivot with the kind of seamless entitlement that only a lifetime of zero consequences could produce. Preston was leaning heavily into his privilege. He was a white man in a room full of wealthy black investors, and he genuinely believed his inherent corporate confidence would act as a magical shield. He thought he could simply talk them down, pat them on the head, and dismiss the hard evidence lying right on the dining room table. Deacon Sterling stopped a few feet away from him, his jaw clenched so tightly a vein throbbed in his neck. Preston offered Sterling a sympathetic, almost patronizing smile. "Sterling, listen to me," Preston continued, stepping forward and attempting to place a reassuring hand on the older man's shoulder. "You have known this family for decades. You know the history here. You know that Kendra was a troubled teenager who broke her parents' hearts and was removed from this community for stealing. She has spent 12 years harboring a massive bitter grudge. This entire display tonight is nothing but the vindictive revenge fantasy of a deeply unwell, disgruntled sister-in-law. She is trying to ruin a family business out of pure spite, and she manipulated some out-of-context emails to do it." Monique, who was still trembling near the shattered crystal on the table, immediately chimed in to support her husband's desperate narrative. "She is sick," Monique yelled, pointing at me. "She is a sick, jealous woman who wants to see us fail. You cannot believe a word she says." Preston nodded solemnly, turning his attention back to the church board members. "Exactly. We cannot let her emotional instability tank our investments. I assure you the capital is secure, The offshore accounts are standard tax optimization vehicles for international software development. I can have my chief financial officer walk you through the ledgers tomorrow morning over golf. Let us not throw away generational wealth over an angry woman's temper tantrum. I did not interrupt him. I did not need to raise my voice to defend my sanity or my character. I just watched as Preston used the oldest trick in the book, attempting to paint a successful independent black woman as angry, bitter, and unhinged to protect his own skin. He truly expected these men to nod along, shake his hand, and agree that women were just too emotional to understand complex finance. Deacon Sterling looked down at the hand Preston had placed on his shoulder. Then he looked back up into Preston's eyes. The older man did not shout. He did not lose his temper. His voice was cold, sharp, and dripping with absolute contempt. "Remove your hand from my suit," Deacon Sterling commanded. Preston blinked, his confident smile wavering for a fraction of a second before he slowly pulled his arm back. "You think you can play me for a fool in the house of the Lord?" Deacon Sterling said, stepping so close that Preston was forced to back up against the archway molding. "I built my automotive empire from the ground up during a time when men who look like you would not even let me drink from the same water fountain. I know a hustler when I see one. You came into our church, you used the pastor's name to gain our trust, and you smiled in our faces while you picked our pockets. You are not a visionary, you are a common thief." Preston swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "Sterling, I swear to you the money is there. Do not ever speak my name again." Deacon Sterling interrupted, his voice echoing like thunder. "I am going to call my attorneys. I am going to call the federal authorities. And I am going to make sure you do not see a single day of freedom for the rest of your miserable life. Now get out of my way before I forget my religion." Deacon Sterling shoved past Preston, forcing the younger man to stumble sideways into the wall. The rest of the deacons and politicians followed right behind him, not offering Preston a single glance as they marched out of the dining room and out the front doors. Preston stood frozen against the wall, watching his entire safety net walk out into the Buckhead night. The realization that his charm offensive had completely and utterly failed finally sank in. His white knight persona crumbled, and the raw, desperate panic returned, bringing a violent rage along with it. He spun around to face me, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. The smooth-talking executive was gone. He looked like a cornered animal ready to strike. "You think you have won," Preston snarled, closing the distance between us with heavy, aggressive steps. "You think you can waltz into my house, steal my private financial data, and destroy my company without paying the price." I stood my ground, my posture perfectly relaxed. "Technically, it is my house now," I reminded him smoothly, "but do go on." Preston stopped just inches from me, his face red and slick with sweat. "I am calling the police," he threatened, his voice rising to a frantic shout. "I am calling the Atlanta Police Department right now. You are trespassing on private property. You committed corporate espionage by hacking into my personal servers. You have criminally defamed me in front of my investors. I will have you arrested and dragged out of here in handcuffs." Monique suddenly found her second wind, rushing to stand behind her husband. "Do it, Preston," she cheered, her voice shrill with vindictive excitement. "Call the police. Let them see what a criminal she really is. Mom and Dad will testify against her. We will press every single charge possible. She is going to end up exactly where she belongs." Pastor Thomas and Vivian, who had finally abandoned her fake fainting spell on the floor, watched eagerly from the other side of the room. They were banking on the threat of law enforcement to finally break my composure. They expected me to panic, to grab my briefcase and flee into the night to avoid being arrested. They thought the fear of being a black woman dealing with the police in a wealthy neighborhood would force me into submission. Preston pulled his latest model smartphone from his pocket, holding it up like a weapon. He aggressively tapped the screen, dialing the numbers for emergency services. His eyes locked on mine to see if I would beg him to stop. I did not beg. I did not flinch. I did not even blink. I simply offered him a warm, encouraging smile. "Please press send." "Preston," I said, keeping my voice perfectly pleasant and loud enough for everyone lingering near the foyer to hear. In fact, put it on speakerphone. "I would love to hear you explain to the Atlanta Police Department why you are calling them to a house that you are actively defrauding." His thumb froze over the glowing green button on his screen. The aggressive, angry red flush that had covered his face just moments ago rapidly drained away, leaving him looking sickly and pale. He was waiting for me to break. He was waiting for the angry black woman stereotype he had tried to project onto me to finally manifest so he could play the victim. But I gave him nothing but absolute terrifying calm. "Go ahead," I urged, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "Tell them there is a trespasser. But you should probably know that the local police are going to be very under-equipped to handle what happens next. You really need to be dialing the federal authorities." Preston slowly lowered his phone, his chest heaving as he tried to regulate his breathing. The deacons who had been marching toward the front doors stopped in their tracks. Deacon Sterling turned around, his hand resting on the heavy brass doorknob, completely captivated by the scene unfolding in the dining room. They all wanted to see the final nail driven into this coffin. "You are bluffing," Preston muttered, but his voice was completely hollow. It was the desperate, breathless whisper of a man who knew he had already lost the war. "I do not bluff," I replied smoothly. "I execute." I unzipped the side pocket of my leather briefcase and pulled out my tablet. I tapped the screen a few times, accessing the secure cloud drive my financial analyst had prepared for me in Chicago. I glanced up at the massive 80-inch smart television mounted above the dining room's custom marble fireplace. It was the expensive television my father used to display his sermon notes during his exclusive Bible study dinners. With a single swipe of my finger, I mirrored my tablet directly to the screen. The television flickered to life, illuminating the dimly lit dining room with the stark, glaring, bright white background of official federal documents. "Since you are so eager to involve law enforcement, Preston, I decided to save you the trouble." "Trouble," I announced, turning my body so the entire room could clearly see the screen. "What you are looking at is a confirmed, time-stamped whistleblower submission receipt from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Right below that is a mirrored submission filed directly with the Financial Crimes Division of the local authorities." Monique let out a choked gasp, taking a step away from her husband as she stared blindly at the television. I tapped my tablet again, changing the slide. The screen updated to show a highly detailed spreadsheet complete with highlighted red rows and offshore banking logos. "These are the exact Cayman Island routing numbers you used to hide the retirement funds you stole from the church board," I explained, tracking the data with my finger in the air. I forwarded every single ledger, every fabricated profit and loss statement, and every fake vendor invoice you created to siphon the congregation's money. The authorities do not just have a tip, Preston. They have the entire treasure map. By the time the banks open tomorrow morning, your accounts will be frozen, your passport will be flagged, and federal agents will be walking into your startup's leased office to seize your servers." Preston's phone slipped from his hand, hitting the hardwood floor with a sharp crack. He did not even flinch. He just stared at the glowing screen above the fireplace, his mouth slightly open, watching his entire privileged existence evaporate into thin air. The arrogance that had fueled him for 36 years was completely gone, replaced by the crushing, suffocating weight of absolute ruin. "You destroyed us!" Monique wailed, grabbing the sides of her head as her flawless hair finally fell into disarray. "You came into our home, and you completely destroyed us." "I did not destroy you, Monique," I corrected her, my tone dropping to a deadly serious register. "Your husband did. I am just the one holding the flashlight. And speaking of the things your husband destroyed, I am not quite finished." I turned my attention away from the shattered tech executive and looked directly at Pastor Thomas. My father was still kneeling on the Persian rug next to Vivian, who was still committing to her fake medical emergency with her eyes squeezed tightly shut. "Pastor," I said, my voice echoing through the silent room, "you thought you were so clever. You thought you could cover up a massive financial scandal by throwing my name around and protecting your golden son-in-law. You were willing to let this entire congregation take the fall just to preserve the illusion of your perfect family." I swiped the screen on my tablet one final time. The television display shifted. The offshore bank statements disappeared, replaced by a scanned copy of a heavily notarized real estate document. The address printed clearly at the top of the page was the exact Buckhead estate we were currently standing in. "But Preston did not just steal from your deacons," I revealed, dropping the ultimate localized bomb. "When the church funds ran dry and his gambling debts continued to pile up, He needed a massive injection of capital to keep his creditors from breaking his legs. He needed high-value collateral. Pastor Thomas squinted at the screen, his aging eyes struggling to read the fine print. Slowly, the realization washed over his face. He let go of Vivian's hand and stumbled backward, sitting hard on the floor as all the strength left his legs. "What is that?" Pastor Thomas whispered, his voice trembling with a terror I had never heard from him before. "That is a second mortgage," I stated clearly, letting the words hang in the air like a guillotine. "Preston used the power of attorney you blindly granted him for the church's commercial investments to secretly leverage this house. He took out a second mortgage on this exact estate to cover his failing margins. He drained every single drop of equity you spent 30 years building." The reaction was instantaneous and spectacular. Vivian, who had supposedly been unconscious and suffering from a severe cardiac event just moments prior, suddenly gasped loudly. Her eyes snapped wide open. The miraculous healing power of impending poverty brought her back to life immediately. She scrambled to her feet, completely abandoning her theatrical performance, and shoved past Pastor Thomas to get a closer look at the television screen. "No!" Vivian shrieked, her hands flying to her face as she read her own forged signature on the loan documents. "No, this is a mistake. This house is paid off. We own this house." "You own nothing," I corrected her coldly. "Preston took the money and he defaulted on the payments 2 months ago, when my firm bought the Buckhead commercial debt portfolio. Yesterday, we did not just acquire Preston's tech company and the church's loans. We acquired this mortgage too. You do not own this estate anymore, Vivian. I do." Monique turned on Preston like a rabid animal. She grabbed the collar of his cashmere sweater, shaking him violently. "Tell me she is lying," Monique screamed, hitting his chest with her fists. "Tell me you did not put a mortgage on my parents' house. Tell me we are not broke." Preston did not fight back. He just stared blankly at the floor, his silence confirming every single word I had just spoken. The remaining deacons at the front door watched the scene with grim satisfaction. They had lost their investments, but watching the arrogant pastor and his fraudulent son-in-law lose their prized mansion was a swift, brutal form of divine justice. Deacon Sterling nodded once at me, a silent gesture of respect, before turning the brass knob and leading the rest of the guests out into the night. The heavy front doors clicked shut behind them, sealing my family inside the tomb of their own making. I stood in the center of the dining room, holding my tablet, completely untouched by the screaming and crying echoing off the walls. I had systematically dismantled their wealth, their status, and their future. But as I looked at the utter devastation on my parents' faces, I knew they were about to do exactly what they always did. They were going to try to save the golden child at any cost. The heavy click of the front door latch echoed like a gunshot through the vaulted ceilings of the grand foyer. The deacons were gone. The politicians were gone. The wealthy socialites had scattered into the Buckhead night, frantic to call their attorneys. The dining room, meticulously staged to be the site of my total surrender, was now just a lavish crime scene. Monique was still screaming at Preston. Her fists hammered against his chest, but there was no force behind the blows. She was running on pure, unfiltered panic. Preston just stood there, staring blankly at the floor. The offshores, the second mortgage, the federal authorities, it had all crashed down on him at once. He was a ghost trapped inside a designer cashmere sweater, paralyzed by the sudden evaporation of his untouchable privilege. Vivian was gripping the back of a dining chair so tightly her knuckles were white. Her eyes darted from the television screen, displaying her forged signature to the shattered crystal on the floor. For a woman who had spent her entire life curating a flawless image, the reality of impending poverty was short-circuiting her brain. Yet incredibly, her survival instinct did not point her towards self-preservation. It pointed her directly back to her favorite obsession. Pastor Thomas slowly stood up from the Persian rug. The booming, untouchable aura he carried in the pulpit had completely vanished. He looked like an old, terrified man. He smoothed the lapels of his custom suit, took a deep breath, and walked toward me. He did not raise his voice. He did not thunder or threaten. He switched to the quiet, soothing tone he used during private counseling sessions in his church office. The manipulation was so deeply ingrained in his DNA that he deployed it automatically. Kendra, please, Pastor Thomas said, his voice dropping to a heavy, desperate whisper. Let us step into the study. We need to handle this quietly. There is no study anymore, Thomas. I replied, my voice crystal clear and devoid of any sympathy. And there is nothing quiet about a federal indictment. Whatever you have to say, you can say it right here in front of your golden child and her criminal husband. He glanced nervously at Monique, who was now sobbing hysterically against the bay window, mourning her lost luxury. He turned back to me, clasping his hands together in a pleading gesture. You have made your point. You proved how powerful you are. You brought this family to its knees. But you must call off the authorities. You have to retract the files you sent to the Securities and Exchange Commission. I stared at him, genuinely fascinated by the absolute depth of his delusion. Retract the files. Your son-in-law stole millions from your congregation. He secretly mortgaged the roof over your head. I am foreclosing on this estate on Monday morning, which means you are officially homeless. And your priority is asking me to save him. Vivian rushed forward, pushing past the broken chairs to stand beside her husband. We are not asking you to save him, she cried, her voice shrill and frantic. We are asking you to save Monique. If Preston goes to federal prison, the government will seize their assets. They will freeze her accounts. She will lose her home, her country club memberships, her entire social standing. The tabloids will destroy her. The church ladies will tear her apart. You cannot let your sister face that kind of public humiliation. The sheer toxicity of her plea was almost suffocating. My mother was staring down the barrel of her own financial ruin, looking at the forged documents that stripped away 30 years of her wealth, and her only concern was making sure Monique did not lose her elite status. The golden child remained completely untouchable in their eyes, even when she was married to the architect of their destruction. Monique chose to wear a diamond bracelet bought with stolen retirement funds, I said coldly. She is a grown woman. She can face the consequences of her own greed. She did not know Pastor Thomas begged, stepping closer, his eyes wide with a pathetic, frantic energy. Monique does not understand corporate finance. She trusted Preston. She is fragile, Kendra. She has always been delicate. She cannot survive a scandal like this. You know how vicious this community can be to a fallen woman. I let out a short, sharp laugh that completely stripped the remaining oxygen from the room. Fragile, delicate, that is fascinating. Because 12 years ago, when you packed my clothes into a cheap duffel bag and threw me onto the streets of Atlanta, you told me I was tough. You told me I would easily survive the scandal of being labeled a thief. You sacrificed me to the wolves without a single second thought, just to protect her. But now that the wolves are actually at Monique's door, suddenly the community is too vicious for her to handle. We were wrong, Pastor Thomas blurted out, the admission tearing from his throat. It was the first time in 30 years I had ever heard the man admit fault, but it carried absolutely zero weight. It was not an apology born of remorse. It was a negotiation tactic born of pure panic. We will make it right, he continued rapidly, his words tumbling over each other. We will give you anything you want. I have a private retirement account, hidden from the church board. It has over $400,000 in it. I will sign it over to you tonight. I will put you on the executive board of the church foundation. I will stand up at the gala next month and publicly praise your private equity firm. I will tell the entire city of Atlanta that you are the most successful, brilliant business leader this family has ever produced. Name your price, Kendra. I will give you anything you desire. Just drop the corporate charges against Preston and release the debt. I looked at the man who had traded my safety for his reputation. I looked at the mother who had gladly enabled my destruction. I looked at the sister who was currently weeping on the floor, terrified of losing her stolen luxury. They truly believed that money and public flattery could buy my compliance. They thought my soul operated on the exact same corrupt currency as theirs. I reached out and gently closed the cover of my tablet. The massive television screen above the fireplace went black, plunging the dining room back into the dim, flickering light of the table candles. I took a slow, deliberate step toward Pastor Thomas, closing the distance between us until I could see the sweat beading on his forehead. You do not have enough money in your secret accounts to buy my mercy, I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register that demanded absolute attention. And I do not need your public praise to validate an empire I built with my own two hands. You asked me to name my price, so I will. I leaned in, maintaining unrelenting eye contact with the man who had thrown me away. I want the truth about what happened 12 years ago broadcasted to your entire congregation tomorrow morning. The Sunday morning sun reflected harshly off the massive stained glass windows of my father's mega church. I stepped out of my chauffeured SUV and onto the sprawling concrete parking lot, taking a slow, deep breath of the humid Atlanta air. I had not set foot on this property in 12 years. The last time I was here, I was an 18-year-old girl being escorted off the premises by church security, weeping uncontrollably, while the congregation whispered about the pastor's disgraced, thieving daughter. Today I was the woman who owned the commercial paper on the very sanctuary they were walking into. I wore a tailored crimson suit that commanded absolute attention. As I walked toward the grand double doors of the main entrance, the usual Sunday morning chatter died down completely. Thousands of parishioners were funneling into the building, and every single one of them stopped to stare. The rumors from Friday night's disastrous dinner party had clearly spread through the Buckhead elite like wildfire. Whispers rippled through the crowd. They knew Preston had done something terrible with the church's investment funds, and they knew I was the one who had exposed him. They parted like the Red Sea as I walked up the marble steps. The head usher, a man who had known me since childhood, looked panicked as I approached the sanctuary doors. He instinctively moved to block my path, looking over his shoulder for guidance. But before he could say a word, Deacon Sterling appeared from the vestibule. The older man placed a firm hand on the usher's shoulder and moved him aside. Deacon Sterling did not smile, but he gave me a curt, respectful nod and personally escorted me straight down the center aisle. The sanctuary was packed to absolute capacity. 3,000 people sat in the plush velvet pews, the air thick with heavy, palpable tension. Deacon Sterling led me to the very front row, the VIP section traditionally reserved for the pastoral family and special guests. I took my seat, crossing my legs elegantly and placing my leather briefcase on the empty cushion beside me. Across the center aisle, sitting in the designated First Family pew, were Vivian and Monique. They were dressed to play the parts of deeply wounded, righteous women. Vivian wore a modest, muted navy dress, clutching a leather-bound Bible to her chest. Monique wore a pale cream ensemble, her makeup applied lightly to make her look fragile and exhausted. She kept dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue, performing the role of the devastated, betrayed wife. Preston was noticeably absent. He was likely hiding in their foreclosed mansion, terrified to show his face in the building he had robbed. The choir finished their opening selection, and the massive sanctuary grew deathly quiet as Pastor Thomas stepped up to the acrylic pulpit. My father looked impeccably tailored as always, but the bags under his eyes betrayed the absolute panic consuming him. He gripped the edges of the pulpit, looking out over the sea of faces before his gaze locked onto mine in the front row. He gave me a brief, desperate nod. He was about to deliver the confession I had demanded. He was about to tell the truth about what happened 12 years ago to save his estate and keep his son-in-law out of federal prison. Or so he thought. Church family pastor Thomas began, his deep melodic voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system. We come together this morning under a heavy cloud of spiritual warfare. The enemy is constantly prowling, seeking to destroy the families that do the heavy lifting for the Lord. And today I must stand before you, not just as your shepherd, but as a humbled father and a tested man. The resident organist hit a low, mournful chord on the Hammond B3 organ, perfectly timing the emotional underscore. It was a masterclass in manipulation, a routine I had watched him perform 100 times. My father bowed his head, letting a dramatic moment of silence stretch across the room. There have been rumors circulating in our community over the last 48 hours. Rumors regarding my son-in-law Preston and his technology venture. I want to address this with total transparency. Preston is an ambitious young man with a visionary heart. But in his eagerness to innovate, he made some severe administrative miscalculations. He entangled personal ambitions with commercial assets, resulting in a temporary liquidity crisis. It was a failure of corporate governance, a naive mistake of a young man trying to move too fast. I sat perfectly still, marveling at the sheer audacity of his spin. He was actively rebranding a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme and offshore wire fraud as an administrative miscalculation. He was laying the groundwork to sweep the stolen retirement funds under the rug, hoping that framing it as a naive mistake would pacify the furious board members. But my father was not finished. He needed to fulfill my ultimatum to secure my silence. He looked directly down at me, his eyes pleading for my compliance as he transitioned to the second half of his performance. But Preston is not the only one who has stumbled. Pastor Thomas continued, his voice trembling with manufactured grief. 12 years ago, this very congregation was rocked by a scandal involving missing building funds. At the time, we were forced to make an agonizing, heart-wrenching decision regarding our youngest daughter, Kendra. The congregation gasped softly. Heads turned to look at me sitting in the front row. Vivian let out a loud theatrical sob from across the aisle, burying her face in her hands. My father wiped a non-existent tear from his cheek. We were facing a crisis of faith and finance. The money was gone lost in a blur of youthful indiscretion and rebellious choices. As a pastor, I had to protect the integrity of this ministry. We had to implement tough love. We made the excruciating choice to send Kendra away into the wilderness, hoping the harsh realities of the world would correct her path. We bore the burden of that secret, protecting the specific details of that dark time to shield our family from absolute ruin. I stared at him, my blood turning to liquid nitrogen. I was not confessing. He was gaslighting a room of 3,000 people. He never explicitly said that Monique stole the money. He never admitted that he and Vivian framed me. He was using incredibly vague, carefully constructed pastoral language to imply that mistakes were made, collectively blurring the lines of accountability to protect his golden child. He was framing my brutal exile as a righteous act of tough love, a spiritual intervention that he had orchestrated for my own good. And look at how the Lord works. Pastor Thomas boomed, raising his hands toward the vaulted ceiling as the organ music swelled. We broke our own hearts to save her soul, and God took that tough love and multiplied it. Today, Kendra has returned to us as a highly successful, brilliant executive. The wilderness did not break her. It built her. And she has come home to help us navigate this current storm. She has come home to offer forgiveness and to help restore her brother-in-law's failing business. The congregation broke into loud, enthusiastic applause. People were standing up, shouting praises, completely swept away by the narrative of a beautiful family reconciliation. They loved a story of redemption. They loved the idea of the prodigal daughter returning with her vast wealth to save the day. Pastor Thomas looked down at me from the pulpit, a triumphant, desperate gleam in his eyes. He thought he had won. He thought this vague, emotionally manipulative sermon fulfilled my conditions. He genuinely believed that by publicly praising my success and offering a half-baked, generalized apology, he had trapped me into dropping the foreclosure and saving Preston. He extended his hand toward me, gesturing for me to stand up and accept the applause to play the role of the generous, forgiving daughter who was writing a $250,000 check to save the ministry. I looked at the man who had traded my safety for his reputation 12 years ago and who was actively trying to do it again right now. I looked at Vivian and Monique, who were peeking through their fake tears, waiting for me to submit to the pressure of the entire congregation. I reached down and unclasped the brass lock of my leather briefcase. I was not going to stand up and smile. I was not going to accept a fake apology built on a foundation of lies. They wanted a public reckoning, and I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. The metallic click of my briefcase, unlatching, sounded like a gunshot in the silent, breathless sanctuary. I did not stand up and wave to the crowd. I did not offer the humble, forgiving smile my father had just practically begged for. Instead, I retrieved a sleek silver flash drive, closed my briefcase, and stepped out of the VIP pew. The plush red carpet muffled the sound of my heels, but the absolute authority in my stride commanded the attention of all 3,000 people in the room. I walked straight up the center aisle toward the elevated altar. Pastor Thomas watched me approach, his charismatic facade trembling violently. He leaned over the acrylic pulpit, reaching his hand out as if to welcome me, but his eyes were wide with a suffocating primal panic. He mouthed the words, "Play along," his face slick with nervous sweat. I ignored his outstretched hand. I ascended the carpeted steps, walked directly into his personal space, and took the microphone right out of his trembling grip. He froze, entirely powerless. He could not yank it back without looking like a madman in front of his devoted flock. He stepped aside his chest, heaving, trapped by his own performative holiness. I turned to face the congregation. The sanctuary was so quiet, I could hear the hum of the massive air conditioning units above us. "Good morning," I said, my voice projecting crisp and clear through the state-of-the-art sound system. "Pastor Thomas has just shared a beautiful poetic narrative about redemption and tough love. He told you that his son-in-law Preston made a minor administrative miscalculation. He told you that I, the prodigal daughter, have returned from the wilderness to offer my wealth to save this family ministry." I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the sea of faces, locking eyes with the church elders and deacons sitting in the front rows. "I am a private equity chief executive," I continued, my tone shifting from polite to dangerously sharp. "I deal in facts, audits, and hard data, so let us dispense with the pastoral poetry and deal with the truth. Preston did not make an administrative miscalculation. Preston ran a highly coordinated predatory Ponzi scheme. He took the retirement funds of your deacons, the seed money of this community, and funneled it directly into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands to cover his catastrophic gambling debts." A collective gasp ripped through the sanctuary. The hushed whispers instantly transformed into a loud, turbulent wave of shock. Down in the front row, Vivian leaped to her feet, her hands waving frantically. "Cut her microphone!" Vivian screamed toward the soundboard at the back of the balcony. "Turn it off right now. She is lying. She is a bitter, sick woman." I smiled warmly down at my mother. The microphone stayed perfectly live. "I own the commercial debt portfolio that holds the mortgage on this very building," Vivian, I announced, ensuring every single person in the room heard the extent of my leverage. "I bought your husband's financial ruin yesterday morning. The audiovisual team works for the bank now, and I am the bank." I turned my attention back to the thousands of stunned parishioners. "But Preston's financial crimes are just a symptom of the disease rotting at the core of this family," I said, my voice echoing with unrelenting authority. "Pastor Thomas just stood up here and told you a tragic story about 12 years ago. He told you about missing building funds. He told you he had to make the agonizing choice to cast me out into the world to save my soul. He framed my exile as an act of divine tough love." I took a step closer to the edge of the altar, looking directly down at Monique. My older sister was completely paralyzed in the pew, her face drained of all color, her hands gripping her designer handbag so tightly her knuckles were white. I did not wander into the wilderness. I stated the weight of a decade of suppressed anger fueling every single syllable. I was thrown to the wolves to cover up a crime I did not commit. 12 years ago, this church was robbed of $15,000. But I was not the thief. I was the scapegoat. Pastor Thomas lunged forward, grabbing my arm in a desperate, reckless panic. "Kendra, stop this right now," he hissed, his fingers digging into my blazer. "You are destroying everything." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at the hand gripping my arm, and then I looked him dead in the eye. "Take your hand off me, Thomas," I commanded, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register that the microphone caught perfectly. "Or I will have you removed from your own altar by federal authorities." He yanked his hand back as if he had been burned, stumbling backward until he hit the pastoral chair. He slumped down into it, a defeated, broken man watching his empire burn to the ground. I looked up toward the soundproof glass of the booth at the back of the sanctuary. I gave a swift, definitive nod. The massive digital screens, flanking the pulpit, normally reserved for scripture verses and choir lyrics, suddenly flashed brilliant white. The congregation shielded their eyes from the glare before the image came into sharp focus. "I am not asking you to take my word for it," I projected over the rising commotion in the pews. "I am asking you to read the evidence." Displayed in high definition across the giant screens was a scanned, officially time-stamped Atlanta Police Department report from 12 years ago. Right beside it was a handwritten letter on personalized stationery. "What you are looking at is a full-signed confession," I announced, tracking the document with my hand. It was written by Monique. 12 years ago, Monique stole $15,000 from the youth ministry and the building fund to pay off her massive credit card debt. She wanted to keep up with her wealthy sorority sisters. When the audit came due, she panicked and confessed to her parents. The crowd erupted. Women in the pews shrieked in horror. Deacons stood up, pointing at the screens, their faces twisting with absolute disgust. Monique buried her face in her hands, sobbing hysterically as the reality of her exposure set in. But the confession was only half of the destruction. I signaled the booth again. The screens transitioned to a new document. This one bore a bright red notary seal and a signature that made the church elders gasp out loud. "This is a sworn, notarized affidavit from Brother Wallace, your former church accountant." I continued, my voice slicing through the chaos. "Brother Wallace conducted that audit 12 years ago. He brought the proof of Monique's theft directly to Pastor Thomas and Vivian. He begged them to handle it righteously. But Monique had just received a full scholarship to a prestigious law school. A criminal record would have ruined her pristine image and destroyed her future." I paused, letting the silence command the room as the congregation read the damning words on the screen. "So instead of holding their golden child accountable," I said, the raw emotion finally bleeding into my steady voice, "Pastor Thomas and Vivian ordered Brother Wallace to alter the ledgers. They pinned the theft entirely on me. They packed a single duffel bag with my clothes, drove me to a bus station, and abandoned me with nothing. They threw an 18-year-old girl onto the streets and told this entire community that I was a hopeless, rebellious thief just to preserve their perfect social standing." The sanctuary absolutely exploded. 3,000 people shattered the holy silence with shouts of outrage, betrayal, and fury. The facade of the perfect, righteous first family completely disintegrated in real time. People who had tithed their hard-earned money, who had trusted this man with their spiritual lives, were now screaming for his removal. Monique could not take it anymore. The walls of her delusion finally collapsed. She leaped out of the front pew, her cream-colored dress catching on the velvet cushion as she scrambled toward the center aisle. She was trying to run, desperate to escape the thousands of furious eyes burning into her back. But she did not make it far. Deacon Sterling stepped squarely into the center aisle, crossing his arms over his chest. 3 other senior board members immediately flanked him, forming a solid human wall of righteous anger. Monique slammed into their path, weeping, uncontrollably begging them to let her through. "You are not going anywhere." Monique, Deacon Sterling boomed his voice, carrying the authority of a man who had just watched his spiritual leader betray everything they stood for. "You are going to sit down and face the community you stole from." Monique collapsed onto the floor of the aisle, a sobbing, broken mess of ruined privilege, completely trapped by the consequences she had dodged for over a decade. Vivian was frozen in the pew, her face buried in her hands, rocking back and forth as her entire social universe violently rejected her. I stood at the pulpit, watching the devastation unfold with a calm, unshakable peace. My eyes scanned the chaotic room, tracking the fallout until my gaze landed near the side exit doors. Amidst the screaming parishioners and the crying family members, I spotted Preston. The white knight tech entrepreneur was not rushing forward to defend his wife. He was not standing by Monique as she collapsed in the aisle. Preston was backed against the wall, clutching his designer jacket, his eyes darting frantically from the furious mob to the heavy oak exit door. He looked at Monique, watching her weep on the carpet, and then he looked at the angry men blocking her path. Without a single second of hesitation, Preston pushed the side door open. He slipped out into the bright Sunday morning sunlight, completely abandoning his wife to face the wrath of the congregation alone, desperately trying to save his own skin before the federal authorities arrived. He left her exactly like her parents had left me. I lowered the microphone, resting it gently on the acrylic pulpit. The truth was finally out in the open, undeniable and absolute. The empire of lies was reduced to ashes, and I had been the one to light the match. The sanctuary remained in an absolute uproar, but the power dynamic had permanently shifted. I did not need to say another word. I stepped back from the acrylic pulpit and handed the microphone directly to Deacon Sterling, who had marched up the altar steps with a face like carved granite. He did not look at my father. He looked at the congregation. He declared an immediate emergency session of the church board of directors right there in the sanctuary. Pastor Thomas tried to scramble to his feet, raising his hands to command his flock one last time, but 2 burly ushers stepped firmly into his path. They physically blocked the man they had served for decades. The vote was swift, brutal, and entirely unanimous. Pastor Thomas was stripped of his pastoral title, his access to the church grounds, and his entire severance pension effective immediately. While the board finalized his ruin, my custom smartphone vibrated inside my tailored jacket pocket. I pulled it out and read a secure text message from my lead financial investigator back in Chicago. We had been tracking Preston's digital footprint since my firm acquired his toxic debt portfolio. The message was concise and utterly devastating. Preston was currently at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, attempting to board a first-class flight to Dubai, but he never made it to the gate. Federal agents acting on the offshore routing numbers and the whistleblower packet I had submitted were waiting for him right at the TSA security checkpoint. My investigator attached a grainy real-time photo captured by an airport contact. It showed Preston pinned face down against the cold terminal floor. His cashmere sweater rumpled, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back, while federal marshals read him his rights. He was not a smooth-talking tech visionary anymore. I was just a fleeing felon who had finally run out of runway. I locked my phone and walked calmly down the side aisle, bypassing the weeping, chaotic mess of my former family. The double doors of the sanctuary opened, and I stepped out into the blinding midday Atlanta sun. The sprawling church parking lot, usually a place of joyous fellowship and post-sermon socializing, was eerily quiet. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second, as local authorities arrived to secure the church offices and freeze the financial records. I walked toward my waiting chauffeured black SUV. My driver stood ready by the open rear door, but before I could step inside, the heavy sanctuary doors crashed open behind me. Pastor Thomas, Vivian, and Monique stumbled out into the oppressive Georgia heat. They looked like refugees from a war they had started and spectacularly lost. Monique had completely lost her designer shoes somewhere in the sanctuary aisle. She was barefoot on the burning asphalt, her cream-colored dress stained with tears and sweat. Vivian looked genuinely aged. Her perfect posture shattered, her shoulders slumped under the crushing weight of public disgrace. Pastor Thomas looked utterly hollowed out. The booming, untouchable man of God was gone, replaced by a desperate, terrified old man facing complete financial and social annihilation. They spotted me standing by the SUV and practically sprinted across the parking lot. They did not have the energy for pride anymore. The arrogance was completely burned away. They were running on pure, unfiltered survival instinct. "Kendra, wait," Pastor Thomas gasped, clutching his chest as he closed the distance. He stopped a few feet away from my security detail, his eyes wide with a frantic, begging energy. "You made your point. You showed everyone the truth. You won. Now please, you have to stop this." "Stop what, Thomas?" I asked, my voice carrying the cool, detached precision of a corporate executioner. "The wheels are already in motion. The bank owns your house. The federal government owns your son-in-law. And the congregation owns your reputation. There is absolutely nothing left for me to stop." Monique fell to her knees on the hard concrete. She did not care about her dress. She did not care about her image. She looked up at me, her face a twisted mask of absolute panic. "Preston left me," she sobbed, choking on her own tears. "He texted me from the airport and said he was getting on a plane without me. And then his phone went dead. The police are going to come for me next. I signed the tax returns, Kendra. I signed the paperwork for the house. They are going to take everything. I have millions of dollars in debt and no way to pay it. You have to buy my house back. You have to hire me a defense lawyer. You have the money. You can fix this." I stared down at the older sister, who had made my teenage years a living nightmare. I looked at the woman who had stolen from the church, bought luxury handbags with offering money, and then smiled while I was thrown onto the street to take the blame. "You are a grown woman, Monique," I stated, offering zero warmth. "You chose to marry a fraudster. You chose to wear diamonds bought with stolen retirement funds. You chose to let me take the fall 12 years ago so you could go to law school. It is time you finally experience what a consequence feels like." Vivian lunged forward, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. She reached out, trying to grab my hand, but I took a sharp step back. "We are your parents." Vivian wept, her voice cracking with profound desperation. "We raised you. We put a roof over your head. We made a terrible, unforgivable mistake, but we were just trying to protect our family. You have hundreds of millions of dollars. You can pay off the mortgage on the estate. You can make the Deacons whole. If you just write the check, we can start over. We can be a real family again. I promise you, Kendra. We will do whatever you want. We will get on our knees and beg." They were offering me the one thing I had desperately craved when I was 18 years old. They were offering me their submission, their apology, and their validation. They were finally willing to see me, to acknowledge my power, and to welcome me into the fold. But they were 12 years and a lifetime too late. I looked at the three people who had thrown me away like garbage to protect a lie. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. I felt an overwhelming, magnificent sense of absolute nothingness toward them. The anger that had fueled me for over a decade simply evaporated into the humid Atlanta air, leaving behind a cold, untouchable peace. I looked my father directly in the eyes, ensuring he heard every single syllable of my final judgment. 12 years ago, you stood on this exact same property and told me that failures do not belong in this family, I said, my voice echoing with devastating finality. I paused, letting the silence stretch between us, as the reality of their destruction permanently settled in. "You were right," I whispered. "Good luck." I turned my back on them and stepped into the cool, air-conditioned sanctuary of my black SUV. I did not hesitate. I did not look back. The heavy door slammed shut with a solid, definitive thud, instantly cutting off the sound of Vivian's wailing and Monique's desperate, breathless sobbing. I tapped the glass partition, signaling my driver. The engine purred to life, and the massive vehicle glided smoothly out of the megachurch parking lot, leaving the ruins of my parents' fraudulent empire shrinking in the rearview mirror. The drive to the private airfield was remarkably quiet. I watched the Atlanta skyline pass by my tinted window, feeling the heavy, oppressive weight of my childhood officially lift from my shoulders. I boarded my private jet, the flight attendant handing me a glass of sparkling water before I even took my seat. As the plane accelerated down the runway and lifted into the clouds, I watched the Georgia trees fade away into green blurs. The toxic, performative world of the Buckhead elite was entirely behind me. I had excised the rot from my history with surgical precision. A few hours later, the jet touched down in Chicago. The air here was crisp, sharp, and invigorating. My driver navigated the bustling city streets, pulling up to the luxury high-rise building where I owned the penthouse. I took the private elevator up to the top floor, the doors opening directly into my sprawling, light-filled home. The smell of roasted garlic and fresh herbs greeted me immediately. I walked into the massive open-concept kitchen to find my partner David pulling a pan of roasted vegetables from the oven. He was a brilliant corporate attorney, man who respected my ambition, matched my intellect, and supported me with an unconditional love that my biological family could never comprehend. David looked up, wiping his hands on a kitchen towel. His face broke into a warm, genuine smile that instantly grounded me. He walked over, wrapping his arms around my waist and pulling me into a deep, comforting embrace. He did not ask how the trip went. He knew me well enough to read the calm, victorious energy radiating from my posture. "Welcome home, CEO," David murmured, kissing my forehead. "It is incredibly good to be home," I replied, leaning into his solid, unwavering support. Later that evening, we sat on the expansive outdoor terrace, looking out over the glittering expanse of Lake Michigan. My phone was completely silent. I had instructed my security team to permanently block every single number associated with my parents, Monique, and anyone connected to their crumbling social circle. I would never have to hear their excuses, their begging, or their toxic manipulation ever again. They were locked in a prison of their own making, drowning in federal investigations, foreclosure notices, and absolute public disgrace. I took a sip of my wine, feeling the cool Chicago wind brush against my face. I thought about the terrified 18-year-old girl who had slept on a park bench with nothing but a duffel bag and a fabricated criminal record. She had survived the wilderness. She had forged herself in the fire of rejection, turning her pain into an unstoppable multi-million-dollar empire. I had not just proven them wrong. I had completely rewritten the rules of the game, ensuring that no one would ever have the power to discard me again. I leaned my head against David's shoulder, surrounded by the beautiful, untouchable life I had built with my own two hands. I had absolute financial invincibility, a loyal, chosen family who valued my heart, and a future entirely dictated by my own terms. The past was finally dead, and the peace I felt in that moment was worth every single battle it took to get here. The ultimate lesson from this journey is that true security comes from within, not from the conditional approval of toxic relatives. Blood makes you related, but loyalty, respect, and unconditional support are what truly make a family. When those closest to you attempt to tear you down to protect their own fragile facades, your most powerful response is unshakable success. Setting firm boundaries is never an act of betrayal, it is a vital act of self-preservation. Sometimes, walking away from the family you were born into is exactly what it takes to build the empire you deserve. Share your own experiences of setting firm boundaries and reclaiming your peace in the comments section below. If this story of turning betrayal into an unstoppable triumph resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more empowering stories of survival and strength.